Thank you very much. Very good afternoon to all of you. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me. So for the next 12 plus 1 minute, I'd like to focus a little bit on the recent developments in the Sukuk market. And the reason why I decided to focus on the Sukuk market is because this is the instrument that had allowed to the Islamic finance industry to increase its reach and to attract attention from all over the world. It's also an instrument that still has a lot of potential. If you look, for example, at the volume of issuance of total Sukuk last year, it was merely 3% of the total volume of issuance of bonds. And also, if you look at the Sukuk as instruments, most of them are still held to maturity type of instruments rather than being actively traded. Now, if you look at the performance in 2019, I think 2019 was a strong year for the Sukuk market. We've seen total volume of issuance of almost $160 billion compared with $130 billion in 2018, which means an increase by almost a quarter. And we've seen also an increase in the foreign currency issuance volume by almost 20%, reaching 39 billion versus 33 billion. However, if you ask yourself where the increase is coming from, it's not coming from the usual suspects or from the countries you would expect to issue on the Sukuk market. The increase was mainly coming from the decision of the Central Bank of Indonesia to start offering Sukuk instrument as liquidity management instrument for its bank. It was coming from Turkey because Turkey has been under tremendous pressure over the last couple of years. So issuers in Turkey were trying to open whatever financing sources available to them. It was coming from Qatar. Qatar was absent from the market a couple of years ago because of the boycott, and now made its comeback through a significant amount of issuance, plus 61%. It was coming from Malaysia, where the government has stepped up its issuance, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. Central Bank of Kuwait, similar story, liquidity management instruments. And Bahrain, where the issuance has not increased by the same speed as last year because the country has started to receive the support from its neighbors. So in Malaysia, who is issuing? It's primarily the government of Malaysia plus the International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation, which is a corporation that was created to offer liquidity management instrument for the Islamic financial industry. And I think the reason why the government of Malaysia has stepped up its issuance, it was primarily because of the restructuring of the Tabung Haji and the transfer of some of its assets to the Ministry of Finance. Now, the base case for 2020, we think that 2020 will be an equally good year for the Sukuk market. We think that the volume of issuance would increase by 5%, including around $40 to $45 billion of foreign currency denominated Sukuk. Why we think that 2020 will be a good year? 4 reasons. I think global liquidity remain abundant, which means that issuers with good credit quality or good credit story would be able to tap the market fairly easily. There's more than $10 trillion of assets with negative yield, for example. Second reason is that innovation is coming. I think we saw a company being launched here in the Gulf trying to come up with a value proposition of simplifying to the extreme the process of issuing Sukuk using blockchain technology and using standard legal documents. Third reason, standard setters, including the AOE have now understood the role they would have to play and are trying to push the standardization agenda in a more aggressive way. We're still not yet there, but there are efforts that are being deployed. And fourthly, the green opportunities or the green Sukuk market, which is expected to grow in light of the significant amount of investments some of the core market of Islamic finance have committed towards energy diversification and towards more sustainability in the energy mix. Now, in terms of downside risks, few of them. Some of them are traditional. For example, if we were to see a significant change in the economic cycle, which could hit some of the core market of Islamic finance, then most probably the volume of issuance will go down. Geopolitical risk is still an important factor into the equation, especially given what happened in January in this part of the world. Third downside risk is the complexity. It's still more complex to issue sukuk, and I think this is something that could drive the growth forward if we were to come with a simplification of the process of issuance. And finally, I think in the first panel, people talked about the coronavirus. The coronavirus can have an impact on some of the core Islamic finance countries. In this region, I think the impact could be either direct through the oil and gas export, given the drop in oil price particularly, and given the impact on the Chinese economy, knowing that China is one of the big consumer of commodities. It could also have some indirect impact via the tourism, spending, real estate, but this is more a story for the UAE and not for the other countries of the GCC. Now, the question here is, what can we do in order to accelerate the market, and what can we do in order to make it more attractive for issuers? The first proposal is to enhance inclusive standardization, and I'm highlighting the word inclusive there because last year, for example, the AOEFI came up with an exposure draft that could have literally killed the sukuk market, in a sense that they were proposing some proposals that were completely disconnected from the reality of the market. And if they were adopted as they are, most probably the market would have stopped. So the idea there is to be able to bring together all the market participants and to come up with proposals that would be acceptable and that would make the process of sukuk issuance as easy and as smooth as the process for bond issuance. Because remember, in 2014, when oil prices started to drop, the governments in the GCC didn't go naturally to the sukuk market. They went naturally to the bond market, because if you are the Minister of Finance of the government that is under pressure to pay the salaries and to pay the contractors, you would go for the easiest solution. And today, sukuk are still far from being the easiest solution, because once you identify your structure and once you identify your underlying asset, you need to go and have a negotiation round with the lawyers, with the scholars, with rating agencies before eventually finalizing your legal documentation and hitting the market. And that process can sometimes take a long time to materialize. So having a process that would be standardized, having standardized legal documents, standardized interpretation of Sharia would definitely help the market and help the value proposition of sukuk versus bond. Second accelerator is the use of the new technology, and I think one of my fellow panelists talked about what new technology could help. And here I'd like to highlight the blockchain specifically, because the blockchain, in our view, can resolve three main challenges that the sukuk industry is facing today, which are, number one, the traceability of the underlying assets, because when you get into a sukuk transaction, the sponsor can substitute the underlying asset. So you might end up with a transaction that has a completely different risk profile without you even knowing. With the blockchain technology, this problem is resolved, because each and every time there's a substitution of the underlying assets, this is documented in the blockchain. The blockchain can also resolve the issues related to the traceability of the performance of the underlying assets. Now, in some of the sukuk, where you have a pool of underlying assets, the performance is typically collected by the sponsor, and typically used to pay the periodic distribution to the investors. And literally, if one of the underlying assets is not performing up to the expectation, the information won't be visible to the sponsor until a few days before the distribution of the periodic distribution amount, which makes the process far from being efficient and ideal, because the implementation of corrective action is usually delayed. Now, with the blockchain, each and every time one of the assets is not operating up to the expectation, you would have something, you'd have a block missing in your chain, and you would be able to implement corrective action in order to make sure that the asset performs up to the expectation. Now, finally, the traceability of the
2 minutes remaining.
investors, the traceability of the investor base. And here, I think if you combine blockchain and smart contract protocol, you might be in a world where sukuk can be resolved outside of court, in a sense that you would document in your smart contract protocol that if X% of the investors say we're going to do this, then this has to happen. And you can send the question or the information through the blockchain, collect the return from the investors in order to take a decision and resolve the sukuk without even going to court, which means a significant economy for expensive lawyers and effort and time. Final accelerator for the sukuk market is all the green related opportunities. I think if you place on a side-by-side the core component of the principle of green investments, or even the principle of responsible investments, and the 5 principles of Islamic finance, or the 5 maqasid al-sharia, you can see natural connection between the two. And I think one of the strongest instrument that could see a significant growth is the green sukuk market. And that's because if you look around in the GCC, you would see that there's a lot of commitment that have been made by the GCC countries in terms of renewable energy, in terms of managing the energy transition impact on their economies. And some of these projects will have to be financed through market-related issuance. And the sukuk instrument could be one of these avenues. For the time being, I think there have been a couple of transactions done by Indonesia. There have been one done in the UAE and one more recent done by the Islamic Development Bank. What we have observed in these transactions is that there were no pricing advantages, meaning that it was not cheaper than a normal sukuk transaction or a conventional bond. However, it had allowed the issuer to speak to a broad new category of investors that would not come if they decided to go the normal sukuk route or the conventional route, which are the investors that are committed to the principle of green investments and the principle of responsible investment, and their number and their assets under management is increasing exponentially and is expected to continue to increase. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much.